Ye marshes, how candid and simple, and nothing withholding and free. Ye publish yourselves to the sky, and offer yourselves to the sea. Sredny Stog. Welcome to this week's episode of Warfare, Advancement, and Revisionism. My name is Preston Floyd, and as always, I'm your host. I'd like to thank you all for joining me. I appreciate the support. If you're a newcomer, welcome. Please enjoy and peruse our backlog of episodes if you haven't already listened to them. And to our returning listeners, thank you guys. So there are a couple of things we're going to start with. Some of you, with the exception of people who maybe watch on YouTube, last week ads ran at the start, and I think a couple other points during the episode. I did not know that was going to happen when I recorded last week. I found out when I was preparing to publish. And I'm going to let these run for a month or so and see what kind of income, that I'll get with my current listenership. If it's not, substantial, I'll probably turn the ads off until, the show gets, a little bit larger. But regardless, I do want to thank, you guys all for listening regularly and continuing the downloads. It really does mean a lot. And, I'm looking to continue the show regardless if it pays out or not. So yeah, I really appreciate it. I can't put that into words. Now there is some bad news on this. This episode is going to be probably very short, and it's not going to be as long as I would have liked to have made it. I got home and was preparing to record, but there was a very bad thunderstorm where I live, and I lost power for quite a while. In fact, I was just about to just call it a night and just head to bed, but the power came on about 15 minutes ago. It is currently 1:24 in the morning, and unfortunately, I have to go to work, so I'm gonna kind of try and knock this out as best I can. We're only going to cover one culture for this week, and it's the one I mentioned last week, Sredny Stog. So this is, I guess, going to be a very short part 2 on our discussion on the material cultures of the Western Eurasian steppe between 6 and 4000 BC, BCE, whichever you prefer. And again, we will continue where we left off last week by talking about the Sredny Stog culture. Now, the name comes from the type site of Sredny Stog. It means middle stack. And the stack is referring to an islet in the middle of the Dnieper River. And basically there's a small chain of little islets where the river meets the Black Sea. And, excuse me. That's where the name comes from. Now, the culture appears to emerge right around, the dates are a little wonky because, again, there's some continuity between the Dnieper-Donets culture that we discussed last week and the Sredny Stog. And I think it kind of emerges around 4,500, give or take a couple hundred years. Before that, and it will last to about 3,500. Though, again, as we've discussed in the past, and as I mentioned last week, it's not existing entirely in all of the areas it gets to at the same time. These people are very mobile, and they move around a lot, and sometimes they leave a place and they never come back, but other people return, or when these people return to it, they're no longer, I guess, what we would classify as Sredny Stog, though they may have, considered it their land. It's just they're living a different mode of life at that point. Basically, Sredny Stog appears to be a development of the Dnieper-Donets culture, or at least a portion of the Dnieper-Donets, and then they kind of become the dominant culture. They spread their culture to areas that the Dnieper-Donets people had been living. And they will go even further east than the Dnieper-Donets did. They get up to the Don River, which, remember, the Donets is kind of like a small, or it's a shorter offshoot of the Don River. It feeds into the Don. So they continue pushing to the east. As they do so, they either influence the people or take over the land still being used by hunter-gatherers that haven't used pottery before, but who've been living, kind of that classic late Mesolithic lifestyle around what is now the modern-day city of Mariupol, or at least the coast along where Mariupol is. They also absorb more people coming up from the Caucasus Mountains. And I'll talk more about DNA in the region in a later episode, but DNA sources from Sredny Stog sites do show that they had, in some cases, as much of a quarter of their ancestry coming from the Caucasus. They typically had wavy hair that ranged from black to brown, though there have been a couple of them that showed that they did have blonde hair, or at least had the potential to have blonde hair. We can't always tell, what they actually had. Their eyes were various shades of brown, though I think there's also a possibility that there may have been some green in there. It's one of those things you kind of have to take as a, take as like a range of color. It's not clear if it's exactly green. Maybe it's closer to a hazel. It's hard to say. Their skin was kind of an olive, what you consider like maybe someone living along the Mediterranean coast in today's time, maybe somewhere along, Syria or southern Turkey or Greece, somewhere like that. Though they probably weren't quite as dark as they're a little further north. They're probably having to bundle up a little bit more, at least in the winter, to stay warm. And then if you go into further north, you get into areas where there's a lot more forests, and they're not as exposed to as much direct sunlight, so maybe not quite as tanned or dark as you would see along the Mediterranean coasts. But that's kind of the general, from the DNA sources we've gotten from Sredny Stog sites, that's kind of like the average, I guess you would say. And also, much like places in China, as opposed to the Middle East, the area is kind of conducive to preserving more DNA sources, which, we talked about this, I think, in both the Egyptian and the Middle Eastern episodes, that, these warmer environments, it's not exactly conducive to always preserving, enough DNA to do really in-depth testing. But so we have more sources to test from than, say, some of those other places, at least at this earlier period. Now, like the Dnieper-Donets culture, Sredny Stog peoples practice a wide variety of food production: hunting, gathering, fishing, herding, and agriculture. And agriculture is becoming more important than it had been for the Dnieper-Donets, but it was still secondary to herding. Primarily, they're herding cattle. Now, their homes were very simple and rectangular, and they were built to be either taken down quickly or to just be left behind. They're not something that they're putting, a lot of effort into, like digging down and creating subterranean floors. They know they're not staying in one place for too long. Their pottery is simple and utilitarian, but it is becoming better made than, say, the early Dnieper-Donets culture. They are also continuing kind of those wavy patterns, the wavy lines that you would see on the pottery of the Dnieper-Donets peoples, but they do continue to kind of develop and experiment, and eventually they begin marking all of their pottery with cords. So they'll impress cords or rope onto the pottery and create patterns that way. Though that may not happen during this period. The Sredny Stog is kind of divided into two phases. One is kind of at the the start, and then the other is around 3,000. Starting around 4,000, going to about 3,500. So basically, the first 500 years and the last 500 years are two different phases. And it's during the last phase you see a lot more variation in the pottery, and you see different types of ornamentation and things like that emerge. Though they do have that already this season. It's just they continue kind of experimenting and creating new forms and artistic expression with that kind of stuff. Now, there is another important development with the Sredny Stog that we need to discuss, and that involves the horse. I talked about last week how some people think maybe the Dnieper-Donets culture was beginning to herd horses. Not everyone thinks that, and the archaeological evidence is a little scant in some of their sites. With Sredny Stog, it's more widely accepted that they may have been the first to start that process. Like the Dnieper-Donets, they were hunting wild horses, eating wild horses. It is a question, though, of, if they were also controlling them as you do domesticated animals, and they perhaps were beginning that domestication process. Most of the Sredny Stog sites, large numbers of horse bones have been found, in addition to, what you would expect from hunter-gatherers, roe deer, things like that. Animals we mentioned last week, those are all present, but horses are showing up more and more at these sites. So they may have had more access to more horses. Though, again, it's debated if these are wild or not. And it's important to remember that the first few generations of domesticated animals are not that distinct from their wild cousins. Now, some bones have been found at a few sites with evidence of bits having been placed in the horses' mouths, and you can kind of see the wear on the bone from where they were biting on bits for hours. Now, those have all been radiocarbon dated, and they proved that they came from a much later period, like the 700s or 600s BC, like that much later. So apparently, they were, those bones or things were discarded, and then, they got filled in, shifted around due to various other human activity and digging and things like that. But it is, again, possible that they may have had some type of lead or bridle or something like that. The horses are not large enough to really ride for long distances for humans. We'll talk more about it in the horse domestication episode, but wild horses at the earliest stages are not much bigger than donkeys, so it's kind of hard for them to bear a full-grown adult human's weight for long stretches or things like that. So they were probably very much like cattle, and they were local to the area. They were probably better suited for it. And one thing that horses do that cows and sheep and goats, or cows and sheep don't do, is that when it snows, horses will use their hooves to kind of dig up the snow or knock it away, and then eat kind of the grass underneath that snow. Cows and sheep do not do that for whatever reason, and their mouths can get cut up very badly. They can sometimes get infected if they're like kind of trying to munch on ice, and that snow gets compacted. It can kind of cut them up and cause damage to them. So part of the reason they're probably becoming more reliant on agriculture is to not only feed themselves, but also to have fodder for cattle and, less importantly, sheep during the winter months. Whereas horses, they're smart enough and they're from the environment and have learned, hey, we need to get under the snow to get to grass and things like that. Another development that Sredny Stog has that the Dnieper-Donets cultures don't exhibit comes with burial practices. The Dnieper-Donets and Sredny Stog both include grave goods. flint tools, things like that, ornaments, shells, all that stuff is present in both Dnieper-Donets and Sredny Stog. However, Sredny Stog will also, or did also, I should say, they would, they had the same types of graves. They were flat pits. They would just dig them down. Not like a deeper hole, but, deep enough to put a human body in. And then they would cover the ground so it looked like it was flat again. And they would, again, include grave goods, much like the Dnieper-Donets. However, they would also have their dead in kind of a kneeling position, or not a kneeling position, but in that, I guess maybe a fetal position almost. They had their knees kind of put up over their chest. Almost, and this is something that other people have talked about with other sites, but possibly it's kind of a sign of rebirth. It's almost like you're a babe in the womb again, except now you're in the womb of the earth, essentially, possibly to be reborn into the next world. So they would do that, and they would also paint the dead or sprinkle the dead with red ochre, which is something you see all over the world. But this is something that you did not see at the Dnieper-Donets. They did not put the knees up to the chest of their dead. They just laid them flat on their back. Now, they would also, in some cases, this shows up more later, they would face them to the north or to the northeast, depending on where they were. So they may have been facing some kind of cultural significance there. We're not sure what it is. It's not where the sun's rising, so who knows what they were facing them in that direction for. And I looked for theories on that, and I couldn't find anything specific. Some people think they may have been trying to face the North Star, but that's all speculation, unfortunately. Now they did bury their dead not in communal graves, but they would bury them close to each other. We found a large number of cemeteries of Sredny Stog peoples. I think the biggest one I saw listed, I think it was on Wikipedia, which I know I hate using Wikipedia as a source, but sometimes it's a nice collation. But the one grave, graveyard had around 40 people, and then a couple others had around 20, and those are the largest ones they found. And then they found some, with, maybe a dozen or so, kind of spread out along their territory. Now, there is a kind of a smaller regional variation of the Sredny Stog I do want to mention. They're known as the Novodanilovka culture. Well, it's not really a culture. It's part of the Sredny Stog, or at least it's considered part of the Sredny Stog. They're in a very limited area. They're on a kind of the middle part of the, or I guess maybe it's more of the lower portion of the Dnieper. They're kind of on the eastern side of the Dnieper River, just north of like the Azov Peninsula on the Black Sea. But they kind of had very similar practices as Sredny Stog. However, what they would do when they buried their dead, they would do virtually the same thing as Sredny Stog peoples, or the other Sredny Stog peoples, but they would lay stones over the graves, which is not something you see anywhere else. And this kind of culture emerges around 4,400. So they were probably just it may have just been a regional variation, but they're considered either part of the Sredny Stog or like an early group that kind of developed a separate burial practice for, this is a theory, but perhaps some type of nobility or warrior caste. This is one of the theories, and we'll talk more about that later when we cover the rest of them. Now, both Sredny Stog and the Novodanilovka, they do acquire copper eventually and begin to use it to make tools and weapons, as well as, jewelry and things like that. However, that's probably not happening this season. That probably doesn't happen until next season. Now, the Novodanilovka, they start around 4,400, and they go to about 3,800. So they're not quite as long lasting as the Sredny Stog. They don't last quite as long. But we'll talk more about that in future episodes, and what replaces both of these groups. Now, I think that's going to go ahead and do it for this week. About 20 minutes. Okay, so a little bit shorter than I would have liked, but unfortunately, I do need to go to sleep, and I still have to get this prepared to publish. Next week, we'll talk about a couple of the other cultures that are kind of like next up in the timeline. And then once we finish up with those, I think that'll probably be the last episode on the cultures. And then I'm going to talk about some language and DNA stuff, and then the horse domestication theories as well. But I do want to thank everyone for joining me this week. Again, sorry for the short episode. Sorry to my YouTube peeps. I'm not going to be able to add images and all that kind of stuff for this week's episode. But I do hope you will forgive me for that. We will, again, be back next week. If you have any questions, comments, constructive criticism, please reach out to me at waradrevpod@gmail.com. You can contact me via direct message on X/Twitter. You can also comment on the YouTube videos, and I will get back to you as soon as I am able. But yeah, I appreciate you guys. And no word yet on the theme music. So I am looking for replacements that I can verify that are not going to get dinged by any kind of copyright claims. I should look on Fiverr and maybe have someone commission someone to make some theme music. Maybe if the payout is good for the podcast, I might use that to kind of put back into it, which is what I plan on doing if I ever get any sizable income from this, until I pay off my car at least. At that point, I'll have more money to spend on the podcast again. So, but I appreciate everyone for stopping by this week. It means a lot. And again, thank you all so much for the support. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope to have you back next week. So have a good rest of your day and week from whenever you're listening to this, and I'll see you all next time. Peace.